So the autonomic nervous system, right? I want you to think of it a little bit like an automatic nervous system. So we have a lot of sensory neurons that can detect various aspects of the energies that are outside us, the stimuli that are outside us, and the stimuli that are inside us, right? And many of those sensory or afferent detection cells, right, respond to stimuli in our worlds, both internal and external, and then they wire up synaptically with other cells and start to send that information right into areas of the brain. Some of these areas of the brain we're going to see allow for kind of conscious perception, and so we have a sense of what is in us and around us, how our bodies are feeling, what are the stimuli that surround us. But a lot of those stimuli also generate sort of unconscious kind of reflexive responses. For example, if you touch a hot stove, right, you quickly reflexively pull back, from that. So there's wiring, like where you have the detection of the injury, right, and the wire goes back into the spinal cord and it connects with another cell. We call it an interneuron, which means sort of a between neuron, which then connects with a motor neuron, which sends its axon out and stimulates a withdrawal response, right? So basically it's a pretty quick, simple circuit, and it generates an emotional response, right? Like a bodily response to something that is unconscious, that you may not be actually immediately conscious of. And there's other kinds of reflexive responses that we make to stimuli without necessarily direct sort of conscious engagement or control. And at the level of our brainstem, actually there are networks and systems that help to coordinate sort of overall output, to prep the body, or to organize the body in very specific ways, depending on whether the stimulus requires stimulus or collection of stimuli that you're detecting at that moment requires some sort of recruitment of energy, so you can deal with something that's significant that's about to happen or that's happening, or that puts you into a kind of a calmer state, right, where you don't need to deploy as many resources at the time. So the autonomic nervous system is like that whole set of inputs and reflexive outputs, that change the state, basically of the body, sort of globally in important ways. So an example would be, like, let's say you're on campus, like if we ever get back to campus, but if you're on campus and you are like walking across campus and it's dusk and you're feeling pretty good, but then you notice there's nobody around, and then you hear a twig snap behind you, and you kind of freeze, you orient, things like the freezing, the orienting. You may realize your heart is racing, your mouth is dry. This is a whole series of reflexive responses that you didn't prep or plan or deliberately engage in, right? Sort of consciously engage in. They just occurred in response to those stimuli. So you have like a lot of this networking that preps your body, in this case for what we call fight or flight, right? But let's say you look around and you see, oh, it's a small kitten, it's adorable, and you pick it up and you take it home, you order pizza, you're sitting there relaxing, and you're petting a kitten, and you're not allergic to cats, you feel good, and you start to relax, your heart rate is down. Well, you're setting in motion a whole set of other sort of bodily responses, sort of automatically in response to these stimuli that are not particularly threatening and have you in a calmer space. What's interesting is I learned about these various systems, as being sort of divided into discrete sort of divisions. We initially learned there was the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system, which was responsible for fight or flight, or what the medical students refer to as fight, flight, fright, and fornication, right? The 4 Fs. And then the parasympathetic nervous system, which is SLUD, the medical students learn: salivation, lacrimation, urination, and defecation, actually. Since that time, a third division has been, kind of added. This is called the enteric division of the autonomic nervous system, and it involves all of the neurons and connections and links that surround the esophagus, the stomach, the small intestine, and the large intestine. There's a tremendous amount of neural architecture in our guts that allow for, the essential sort of extraction of nutrition, nutrients from food, and, the movement, the coordination of the movements of peristalsis, moving food down, the esophagus, for example, and its transit through the gut, etc. And this is an incredible second brain. Actually, that's now considered a third, separate division of the autonomic nervous system that can run, rather independently. In fact, it runs better if you don't mess with it. Even people who have, like, sort of spinal cord transection, for example, who have, like, are paralyzed, below the neck, etc., can still have, they put food in the mouth, they can completely, that enteric nervous system can operate, fine. It's a very complicated set of what are called plexi. They have, like, sheets of neurons that actually surround, again, the entire tube, the gastrointestinal tract. And they release, all the neurotransmitters that you find in the central nervous system, you actually find released in pretty much in the gut. And there's lots of communication between the enteric nervous system and, the brain. Some of it is, there's lots and lots of afferents, like sensory neurons in the gut that project back into areas of the brain. We're going to learn about a particular lobe called the insular lobe, sort of deep in the middle of the brain here, that receives a lot of gut information from your enteric, division of the autonomic nervous system, and tells you, globally about what's going on. How do I feel? Like, am I stuffed? Am I nauseous? Like, what's going on in my gut? But there's also, a remarkable community of organisms that we are learning about, the microbiome, right, that exists in the gut. You've got, billions of things that live in you and thrive in you, a whole community, and they release chemicals and factors that also can sometimes travel through the bloodstream as well, and influence the activity of our brains. We're learning more and more about the importance of that enteric division in terms of our mental health and the health of the central nervous system. But the other two divisions, that have been talked about a long time, include the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. This is, you find the primary neurons for this, kind of network in the spinal cord, in this nucleus called the intermediolateral cell column of the spinal cord. You have short axons from those cells that go to ganglia that hang up and down the sides, basically of the spinal cord. They call them the sympathetic chain ganglia. And then you have longer axons that work their way out to the organs, like the heart, for example. And what's interesting is that there is a structural consistency to this functional system, this sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system that's involved functionally, right, in fight or flight responses. And yet there's also a structural kind of consistency that holds and ties, these various components together. So the neurotransmitter that's released on the heart, basically, and other organ systems as part of sympathetic activation is actually norepinephrine. And that sort of ties, this sympathetic division together. The same is true for the parasympathetic division. Remember SLUD, salivation, lacrimation? Well, those are two things that are happening at the head, right? Salivation in the mouth. Lacrimation is tearing, right? Crying. And so there is a brainstem output, for the parasympathetic division, which also is, the kind of primary parasympathetic division. There's a cranial nerve called the vagus nerve, which emerges from nuclei in the brainstem and works its way into the various organ systems in the gut, the upper viscera, including, for example, the heart. And then there's also a sacral, like the lowest part of the spinal cord. There's another nucleus for parasympathetic output that goes and supports the salivation and lacrimation, the urination and defecation aspects of the parasympathetic output. And the axons that leave from the brains and the vagus nerve, right, and from the spinal cord, they're longer. And then they go to these ganglia that are actually close to the heart, for example, or close to the other organs that they're innervating. And then they have short axons from those ganglia, let's say onto the heart, and they release a different neurotransmitter. It's completely different. They release acetylcholine. So there are these structural divisions, right? Structural differences that segregate out these different divisions, sympathetic and parasympathetic of the autonomic nervous system. The last thing I want to mention about the autonomic nervous system is that we used to think of it as like it's on or off, or something like you have just sympathetic or just parasympathetic, and that's not true at all. Like these networks and these responses are operating in parallel. So, it's the balance between them that will shift. Like if, a tiger leapt at us or something, we'd suddenly have a huge increase in sympathetic output and, a lot more norepinephrine circulating and a lot more fight or flight. But we're learning very interestingly how the parasympathetic system, will still be active potentially during this period, and actually our ability to modulate and regulate parasympathetic activity is very important in terms of controlling the sort of emotional roller coaster of our lives, right? Being able to, be stimulated by, sympathetic activation in response to certain stimuli, but then to modulate that, utilizing parasympathetic output. And that comes often, with experience and with, lots of social circumstances where you are learning and rewarded, for, your behavior or your decision making in those contexts. So we can talk more about this in class, but the autonomic nervous system is a very, very critical component, of our nervous system.